In this lesson, we're going to be talking about plate boundaries. Plate boundaries are the location where our two tectonic plates are coming into contact with one another. Okay, so plate boundaries, where our two plates are coming into contact with one another. We have three different ways that our plate boundaries can come into contact. So the first one is going to be a convergent plate boundary. Okay, and so with a convergent plate boundary, our plates are moving toward one another. So if we draw arrows to represent this relationship, it'll look like this. Okay, so they're moving toward one another. And we have a couple different outcomes for when these plates come into contact like this. So the first one is we can get a volcano. Okay, and so the two situations for a convergent boundary for when we will get a volcano is when we have oceanic or continental crusts coming into contact with one another, or two oceanic crusts coming into contact with one another. So, first one will be oceanic, or and when we have these two plates coming into contact, what we end up having is we have one plate that is more dense than the other and one that is less dense than the other. And so the one that is more dense will go underneath the other. Okay, and so as this happens, the one plate that is more dense going under is going to be pushed deeper and deeper down beneath the surface of the Earth. And as this happens, the temperature increases and we start having rock melting. And when that happens, it will be pushed back toward the surface and we will have a volcano forming. The second thing we can have happening at a convergent plate boundary is a mountain. So, we'll write this down. And we will have a mountain form when we have two continental plates coming into contact with one another. So that will be when we have And the reason we end up with a mountain is because our two continental plates are of the same density. So we're not going to have one plate being pushed beneath the surface of the other. So instead what we have happening is our plates push together, and as they come into contact they start pushing one another upward and we have a mountain forming. So the two different outcomes that we can have at our convergent plate boundaries will be a volcano or a mountain. The second type of plate boundary that we have is a divergent plate boundary. Our second one divergent. So at a divergent plate boundary, our plates are moving away from one another. So our arrows are pointing away from one another. And at a divergent plate boundary, as they are pulled away from one another, what we end up having is a gap forming in between our two plates. And this gap is going to be filled with molten rock. So we're going to have a gap, and then filled with molten rock. And so when we have that filled with molten rock, we end up with something called a rift valley or a mid-ocean ridge. So we're going to have a rift valley or a mid-ocean ridge. Two different names, same thing. Okay, and so that is a divergent plate boundary when our plates are moving away from one another. And finally, our third plate boundary will be a transform. And the arrows represent this type of plate boundary. They're moving past one another in opposite directions. Okay, and so when this is happening, these plates are grinding past one another without destroying any of the lithosphere, or the surface of the Earth. Okay, so those are our three types of plate boundaries. We have our convergent, divergent, and transform. And in each of them, we have different outcomes as a result of how our plates are moving in relation to one another.